Hello everyone, in this section, we will learn the UI building principles. The UI building principles include the following knowledge points. First, we will introduce the UI building principles, then we will introduce the applicable scenarios commonly used in absolute positioning environment and relative positioning environment, and finally we will cooperate with a case to explain in the classroom. First of all, let's understand the UI building principles. In the final analysis, the UI building principles have only one sentence, which is very simple, that is, when the conditions are met, the levels are the least. How should the UI building principles ensure the minimum levels when the conditions are met first? This involves the application of each scenario. First, let's talk about our absolute positioning scene. The absolute positioning scene has the following advantages. First, its production is very convenient. How to understand it? Let's check it in the editor. Let's open a relatively positioned card we made yesterday. Let's select such a card. We will expand all its subsets in the number of objects. We found that in order to make such a card, we first added an icon on the left, then added a picture, and then added a column on the right. Then, in the column, the first row is a text, and then below the text, we made a row containing price and purchase quantity. Then there is another gift line. We will find that such a production is very troublesome as a whole. However, if we use the absolute positioning environment to make such a logic, how should we make it? This should be very familiar to everyone. First of all, we can pull out such a container with absolute positioning, and then we can copy a part of the widget in it. We can see such a picture, and we can put it in such a position. For such a check mark, we can put it in such a position. Then, for the same text, we also make a series of copies. We set its width, which is almost the width. We set it to 200, and we set it to 50. Then it seems to be a little smaller here. We can also adjust it dynamically. This should be appropriate. Then there is a price on the lower left. Let's copy the price. The price is about 120 wide, and then the height is 5050 watts. It's too big. Drag it, and then drag the part on the lower right. We still paste it in our absolute positioning, even in the absolute positioning line. No, we cannot. We drag all the contents out of this, delete this line, and then drag such a widget to a proper position. Set its width and height to 20 pixels, then the same minus sign here, and a plus sign here, and then align the two to a point. Let's have a top alignment, and fine-tune this. Then there is a gift and such a text below. We also copy it. Then there is the gift. Let's copy the gift. Let's give it a height of 14 pixels, then give it a width of 30, and finally clear the background color and click to finish. This gift is really not very good looking, but we won't go to Nonwho to check its detailed specifications. Here we'll do it roughly. But in this way, if we do it through absolute positioning, you will find that one thing is whether it is abnormal and simple, that is, we just need to find out the approximate position of each widget, and we can complete the production of such a shopping cart card. If we want to make a simple adjustment as a whole, its production is very convenient. Then the second point is that it is a production separated from a flow layout. How do we understand this? We still open a case like yesterday, and we can find that there is a price here that can be placed and reviewed even if an order is placed. Then let's think of such a thing as an immediate place to place an order and establish a provenance. Does it squeeze the above elements? No, it is just like an airship floating in the air. Therefore, such an airship floating in the air is out of our flow layout. We need to make a production with our absolute positioning. We need to make up the content of this part. For in property of this kind of island, we only need to find a positioning point. So, where do we find the positioning point here? Is such a point on the left at this position? It won't change anyway, so we'll add an absolute positioning container here, set its width and height to 0 and 0, and then move it to the front of us, and then this is our positioning point. It's convenient for everyone to understand. Let's set the distance of the positioning point a little. Let's have a positioning point of 5 pixels. It can be found that we always locate this location point here, and whether it appears or not is based on its subcontainer. Who is the subcontainer? Such a location point is based on such a 5-pixel point. So when we understand this point, we can change such a positioning point into a 0, and then there will be an effect of placing an order now and putting it on trial, and it is completely suspended on it. So if we need to use such a suspended property, we actually need to use it in our absolute positioning environment, a feature like layout. Okay, after talking about the advantages of absolute positioning scenario, let's talk about one disadvantage of absolute positioning environment. The first point is that one of its boundary sizes is completely fixed. How do we understand this? For a shopping cart card like ours, whether a gift is displayed or not should be from the data in the backend. If the backend gives it such a data, a gift like this will be displayed. If the current line of cards does not have such a gift, it should be hidden. If such a gift is hidden, we can see whether the following element should be moved online, and why such an element will be moved online. This is because the shopping cart card we selected is a relatively positioned container, and the height of the relatively positioned container itself can be selected as a package, that is, how many elements are in it, and its height is the sum of the heights of the elements in it. For our absolute positioning container, does it have such a package property? No, its height is fixed, which is what we call fixed boundary size. For us, even if I put such a card, let's drag it to the front, and then hide such a card, I will hide such a gift line. You see, there will be no change in this hiding. Why? Because this concealment will only make the internal element invisible, and the height and width of the external hole will not change in fact, so for us, it does not have such a property of wrapping, so a boundary of it is completely fixed. Therefore, whenever we need such a dynamic boundary, we may change the height of a card as a whole according to the display of the elements inside. This is what we call boundary change. In terms of this boundary change, we can only use relative positioning, not absolute positioning. In addition, there is another disadvantage of absolute positioning scene, that is, it is unable to make an adaptive internal. How can we understand this? In fact, this is very good. Understand? Let's go straight to a preview to see the effect. We can find that since you look at the left and right sides of our side, including the distance above us, and the symbol of such a small x on the right, we use the property of relative positioning of its own space to do it. In other words, if it is located on the left and right, it will change dynamically according to the size of our screen, so it can also make an internal self-adaptive effect through a series of settings such as our equal spacing, maximum width, minimum width, and so on. As far as our absolute positioning environment is concerned, it is based on the location of its container, that is, a location of our container. It is always in such a location. Therefore, no matter how we make a change, you can see that there will be no change in the internal elements. After learning the absolute positioning scenario, it has one of its advantages and disadvantages. Next, let's learn about the advantages and disadvantages of relative positioning scenario. First of all, the first point is that it has the greatest advantage and the greatest necessity of its existence, that is, it has rich adaptive effects. In fact, as we learned yesterday, we should have understood that for the overall shopping cart card, its width and height can be selected as package or open, so it can complete an adaptive boundary inside. In addition, it can also use a method of equal spacing, maximum width and minimum width, or even environment width, to do a variety of adaptive effects, which are the functions that we absolutely positioning the scene does not have. So the biggest advantage of relative positioning scene is that it has a very rich adaptive effect. So for us, as long as our application is to make an adaptive effect, we all use our relative positioning scene, but it also has a disadvantage. The first point is that it is very complicated to make. In fact, we found such a problem when we made a practical demonstration. For example, when we made such a card, it will have very many rows, columns, and then add another row. Then we may have to set various properties for it, including equal spacing and outer margin, wait for a series of attributes. And for our absolute positioning, where is it? We just input its position directly, and we can complete such a very simple production. Therefore, it is very easy to understand the complexity of production. Then, the second point is that there are too many levels, which is easy to consume performance. What is a level? Every time I open such a card, I open it once. You can see that there is another column added below it. That is another level of ching-ching. I open the column again, and then there is another row wrapped below it. I open the row again, and there is another row wrapped inside the row, and a widget of a series of columns added inside the row. So this is a problem of our level. Therefore, for such a line or force, in fact, the browser is calculating its position in real time, which is bound to consume a lot of performance. For the positioning of our bureau, it is set at such a position. Therefore, for such a case, the lower the level, the lower the performance it consumes. Then, the third point is that we must form a squeeze, that is, what we call it is still in the bull market layout, which leads to a lot of scenes that he can't do. For example, if you look at a Chinese font like this, we can still put an order on trial 76.5. Let's think about it. If I don't use a positioning point to add a text to our absolute positioning, if we use relative positioning, whether there is an extrusion here immediately, it will the card on the top is squeezed down, and there is bound to be a series of blanks. Therefore, for us, this scenario cannot be done by absolute positioning. After we understand the applicable scenario of absolute positioning and the applicable scenario of our relative positioning, let's take a look at our UI building principle. The UI building principle is in a word to ensure that it has the least one level when the conditions are met. Since we want to meet the principle of minimum levels, which level of relative positioning and absolute positioning is the least is our absolute positioning. Therefore, in general, if we can use absolute positioning, we can use absolute positioning, because if we use absolute positioning, the performance of the whole browser is very good. But we should note that there is a keyword called energy. What is energy? This is because we actually need to make an adaptation in many scenes. However, we can't completely use our absolute positioning when we need to make an adaptation in that scene. Here is the simplest example. You can see that we add a column here, and then in this column, we choose a height of it as a support. In this case, no matter how big or small a window is, it can ensure a normal preview, but if I don't add it here, I don't add it for such a column container, I directly use absolute positioning to make the whole page. Will it lead to that no matter whether any mobile phone looks that its fixed settlement column is in the same position, it can't be adaptive. Therefore, even our mobile phones need to achieve an adaptive effect, so it shows that relative positioning is actually very, very common in our actual use, so it is finally summarized. This is that when our main body uses relative positioning, and when we can use absolute positioning locally, we use it nested our absolute positioning, which is all the principles of UI construction in HeCode, requires an understanding memory for big housework.